Greetings, GateCrashers family. I am RJ Durrani, and I will be your host for this interview. I am privileged to have joining with me today a mark of all trades, if you will. If you search our guest's ever-growing Wikipedia page, you will find he is a WGA award-winning television writer producer who has worked on Star Trek Picard, Carnival Row, Treadstone, Castle Rock, Critical Role, The Legend of Vox Machina, Masters of the Universe Revelations, which I'm very excited for, and Alphas. From his roots as a journalist to his ventures into comics, working on such classic superheroes as Spider-Man, Nightcrawler, Wolverine, and many, many more. Our guest also finds time, I don't know how, to be a frequent collaborator with New Jersey's own. Did he mention that, Kevin Smith, that he's from New Jersey? Of course he did. On the podcast, Fat Man Beyond. He is vengeance. He is night. Please welcome Marc Bernardin.
Hey man, how are you?
Doing well. Let's just jump right into it. Kudos to the entire team who worked on A Door in the Distance, because not only is it visually stunning, it's just a wonderfully moving story, and it's connected with so many people who not only have children on the spectrum, but even outside that realm. I mean, something like that to grip every single community, it's incredible. I mean, dropped yesterday, June 15th,
hmm
and we're already number one in new graphic novels. I mean, not to boost you all the way up there, but you definitely you definitely deserve it. I'll get into kind of the afterword that you wrote in a little bit, but first, just tell me about the inspiration behind Adore the Distance and just kind of the journey to get you there.
well, I mean, the idea first popped in my head. I mean, and it's a very personal book for me for lots of different reasons, but chief among them is that I have a child who's on the spectrum. My
Mm-hmm.
daughter, who is now 18, but when she was first diagnosed at 2.5, um, it's the sort of thing that knocks you for a bit of a loop as a parent because you have your
Mm-hmm.
own ideas and plans and dreams for what the future will hold. And as I began sort of wrestling with that and talking about it with friends and family, knowing that I was a journalist, knowing that I'm a writer, they would all say like, you should write about that. And I'm like, well, yeah, but I didn't want to write the sort of the memoir version of that. I didn't want to write
Mm-hmm.
here's what it's like to be a parent with a child with autism, and really what's it like going through this process for me. I was like,
Yeah.
I'm not interested in that. it's
No.
it's of all of us involved here, like I have the least interesting version of this story. I
Mm-hmm.
have less questions about my version of the story. The biggest question I have is what's going on inside her head. And she's not particularly verbal, so expressing things like feelings and emotions is hard for her. So it falls to us as her parents to imagine how she's feeling, imagine what's going on through her head. And I was like, I want to do that story. Like that story seems fun. Like that story seems interesting. And also because I'm a nerd, that story was going to take some form of like quest-based narrative with like knights and
Mm-hmm.
monsters and pirates and all consuming forces on one end and plucky princesses with power on the other end. And it eventually just evolved into what A Door in the Distance is, which is just a story about a very young woman who is trying to do the most she can to save the people she loves.
Mm-hmm.
And that journey will take her into the uncharted and the unknown, and how she navigates the dangers of a strange world, um, with sort of compassion. Like I didn't want this story to end, and I'm not going to give away how it ends because please read the book. But it was never a story that was designed to end with punching. you
Yeah.
know and the resolutions for the story were about acceptance and not resistance. um and so yeah, I'm glad that over those 15 years now since that diagnosis,
Wow.
we were able to hold on to that thread of the book,
Mm-hmm.
and retain what made it to me a special story to tell. And it's not to say that it wasn't hard to do, because it was. We in that 15 years, I'd spoken to lots of different publishers and editors and would-be collaborators about it, and everybody had their ideas, some of which were great, some of which ultimately were incorporated into the book.
Hmm.
But you know, there was always that thread, that spine that I wanted to circle the wagons around and protect, and that was the resolution. That was how she greeted the unknown, was the most important part.
And I mean, coming from a parent myself of a child on the autism spectrum, same way, diagnosed at 2, relatively nonverbal. I mean, we are just now at the point, he's 7 now, where he's able to speak in full sentences, and we're progressing in that way. And you know, it's a blessing there. But you constantly, every day, just remember every step. Sometimes there's a struggle with it, and you know, just seeing this book all the way through, it just the journey, and then towards the ending, again, I'm not going to give it away either, obviously, but there was a lot of heart in it, and I was not expecting that at all. And I will definitely say, jumping to the afterword, I just want to pull up 2 quick quotes, if that's okay.
Hmm.
Beautifully written, if I might add. If you've met one kid on the autistic spectrum, and there's a pretty good chance you have, you've met just one kid. Though there can be some commonalities, each child is different, special, magical, and challenging in their own specific way. And of course, the other one, because being a parent of any child, autistic or not, it is not about you, it's about them. We are supporting characters and their stories. Hopefully, we're there to help them on their quest and not, as we all too often fear, hinder them. Damn. I mean, that's the only way I could, you know, thoughtfully put this reaction, because in both senses, especially with the first one, you're absolutely right. You mean one kid on the spectrum, you've just met one kid, and so many times they want to put them into this rigid box of this is how it's going to be going forward. And no, as you go on talking about, you know, maintaining this brilliancy as a chef with grilled cheeses, you know, I myself had to master the art of air frying chicken tenders, because guess what, that's that's what he enjoys. So again, it was a real blessing, you know, to be able to read this and kind of see these moments unfold, and also have a damn good story with it. I mean, it in itself is a true graphic novel where, you know, there's a clear middle, beginning, and there is a story. There is definitely some heroic movements to it, and you just simply are like, okay, what's the next page? Okay, what's the next page? Um, but I kind of want to talk on your relationship with your daughter. What is your favorite thing to do with her? What is your like quality spending time with her?
um, the oddness of the way her autism manifests is that,
Hmm.
you know, ultimately she is probably intellectually between like 7 and 8 years old. You know, even though
Hmm.
she's going to be 19 in she'll be 19 in November, but um, so there's this weird thing where she will still act as if she is just above a toddler, you
Hmm.
know. So you know, I'll come home from work or whatever qualifies as work these days, um you know, and she'll just sort of like climb up on my lap and want cuddles, you
Yeah.
know, and like, yeah, she's a grown ass woman at this point,
Hmm.
but that's still where she wants to be. Like, she still wants to play, she still wants to, you know, she still wants tickles, she still wants all those things that she wanted as a little girl. And
Hmm.
selfishly, it's great, you know, because yeah, I have plenty of friends who've got teenagers and, you know, post teenagers who want nothing to do with them.
Nope.
You know, just like, see you later, dad. We'll go to see you when Thanksgiving, and then, you know, 6 months later you run into your kid again. Um,
Hmm.
that is not my experience. And while the desire for that to have been the life that she was going to lead, you know, the side effect of it is that I still get to have this kid who, you know, is still like madly affectionate and wonderful in her own ways. And so yeah, that part of it is entirely selfish on my part. Where, you know, she'll want my attention, and she'll reward that attention with sort of physical love, which is fun.
Hmm. And I think that kind of holds to a statement I once heard, that, you know, it's all about the small victories, and that's
Hmm.
kind of gets you to the next step, next step, next step. But focusing back on, uh the novel itself, it started out Adora and the Big Nothing, and we've kind of transitioned this long, you said 15 years of writing.
Mhm.
So obviously some of that was writing during the pandemic, I'm assuming, which was there a struggle with writing during then? Like kind of like how did you kind of focus your time to make sure, yeah, I got to get this done. I got to get this to print. I got to.
Yeah, I mean the pandemic was weird for any number of reasons, for all of the reasons.
Hmm.
Um, and writing was hard, especially the first like 6 to 8 months of it. And not that that writing was on Adora. By that point, most of my work had been finished. I was doing lettering passes on Adora. I was doing like
Oh,
final
okay.
tweaks on
Hmm.
Adora, but the art was finally finishing its journey. From Ariella's inks to Brian Valenz's colors, like all that was coming together. Like so, I had that moment in like June of last year when we finally
Hmm.
had like all of the colors in place, and was reading it in its entirety, which was its own like kind of majestic experience. Um, but yeah, I had finished I think my last pass on the script in like 2019, like early 2019.
Hmm.
Um, but I mean, to your point though, writing during the pandemic was impossible. I was able to work on other people's stuff.
Hmm.
Like I was on staff on Star Trek Picard for the first, whatever. Like I started in March and I went to the office twice, and then we locked down for the pandemic, and then
Hmm.
finished my stint while still in lockdown.
Hmm.
And I think I wrapped on that show in October of last year, and so I was able to do that because it's not mine. Like, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
invested in it, but sure, I can make Picard say
Yeah.
these things. That's totally
Yeah.
fine.
Hmm.
Um, but it was the new stuff I couldn't get done. Like I couldn't break new ground on anything that
Hmm.
was belonging to me. And I beat myself up about it for the first couple of months, which is like I have this time. Like this is the thing that every writer hopes for. It's just like
Hmm.
unlimited time and no distractions and no place to go, and you don't have to fight the traffic in LA, and you don't have to deal with meetings upon meetings, and like you've got time to focus, and I couldn't focus.
Hmm.
And the realization I came to was that um, we were all undergoing a steady and always varying version of trauma, and we were
Hmm.
unable to recover from that trauma because there was always new trauma.
Hmm.
Like I remember because I was in New York for 9/11, and I remember what that felt like, and I remember that like a bomb went off in the middle of our worlds, and it was devastating and awful, but it was one event, and then we could recover and we could heal and we can process and we can finally start to move forward. Whereas the pandemic was just this steady drumbeat of inflections into our sort of mental state, and then when you add that on top of the protests, on top of Black Lives Matter, on top of all of it, it was just this like I couldn't find any way to get the oars in the water until probably like October or November of last year, and then was able to write a thing and finally take advantage of the time that I had at home. But it was hard, like, and there was no getting around it, and it was different for everybody. Like I know people who were totally fine and oblivious and like were able to focus, but I always advocated like, listen, if you're a creative person and you're unable to create, that's fine. Like don't beat yourself up about it because you're processing and it takes a
Yeah.
while to get that done.
Well, I'm just glad that it wasn't the and for us it was the making bread and let's purchase a exercise bike that we'll use a couple of times and then just collect dust in the corner. But I absolutely agree with you. You sat through an entire year of just watching the news, and everything was what's next, what's next, what's
Mhm.
next. And you just see everything from this push for social change, these staunch instances of injustice. And it's hard. It's really hard to try and push that out of your mind and be like, I need to write this. I need to sit down and focus on this, when you have a million other voices telling you do this, do that, do this.
Yeah.
So definitely a credit to you to sitting down and just saying, this is the time, I got to get back into this. But um specifically, and I saw a couple influences while I was reading Adora. Was there anything particular that kind of, I hate using the word twice, but influenced you in this work especially, or kind of was it an absence of similar works that pushed you to be like, I need to make this. This is something that needs to get out there.
Well, I mean, there's the obvious kind of influence that I think anybody who does anything in the fantasy realm has to
Hmm.
acknowledge, which is Lord of the Rings and Tolkien and just quest narratives. You know, the idea that here we are, a band of adventurers heading off into the unknown to win the day. And so that's always a part of it. You're always mindful of that, and it's helpful because at least you know the things you can pay homage to and be straight up front about, and then the things you want to subvert, because any 60-year-old narrative has time for inversion and subversion. um, there's things that I loved as a kid, like I was a big fan of like Three Musketeers and the Count of Monte Cristo, and that kind of like daring do, and the Tales of High Adventure. Conan the Barbarian is also a big influence. But I think the thing that kind of unlocked it for me was an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It was the musical episode, Once More with Feeling, and there's this line in that Buffy Summers sings, because and if you don't are familiar immediately with Once More with Feeling, Buffy, said vampire slayer, died at the season finale of the season before. She'd sacrificed
Hmm.
herself to save her sister, and she went to Valhalla for her well-earned award as a warrior for truth, justice, in the American way. So the sixth season, I think it is, opens with her friends trying to bring her back from the dead. And it's a musical, and because it's a musical, people can sing the things they would never say out loud. And so when Buffy gets brought back from the dead to join her friends on the mortal plane, she sings this line that goes something like, "I think I was in heaven, and my friends pulled me back. Like everything was fine. I had gone to where I'd lived my life. I'd achieved my destiny. I'd done the work, and I was happy. And then my friends pulled me back, and I don't know if I could ever forgive them for pulling me out of heaven." And so, like that sentiment um, directly influenced the sort of the long story of Adora, which again, not going to spoil it because I hope you would read it. But once you
Yeah.
get to the end of it,
Hmm.
I think you'll understand how that sort of harmonizes with the ending of Adora, and that feeling of, am I where I was supposed to be? And if not, is this where I am supposed to be? And how do I feel about that?
Hmm.
And how should I feel about that? And yeah, I think those like sort of big influences that I think lots of people who work in the genre feel, and then the kind of smaller influences of a uh, a musical episode of a vampire show.
Hmm. First off, I love the fact that you were able to pull Buffy right out of the air and just, sister-in-law is a huge fan, and I'm sure when she hears this she'll be fangirling. But I would like to pull out something and just clarify with you. There was a line, uh, and I have to say I'm a big Stephen King fan.
Mm,
And I'm not going to point out where it is, but someone says, there are worlds other than these. And if my recollection is, that is pulled from the Dark Tower series. Jake Chambers says it at one point, talking to Roland Deschain. And I just wanted to know if that was put there intentionally, if that was, or it just was happenstance that was just a perfect line and it fit in at the moment.
it's both, if that makes
Okay.
sense.
Yes.
Um, like I did a very deep dive on Stephen King when I was working on Castle Rock.
Hmm.
Um, and
Phenomenal
so
show, by the way. Phenomenal
thank
show.
you, thank you. But there was I was a big King reader as a kid, and as a sort of young adult, but there were always pockets
Yeah.
in my knowledge because there's a lot of King. I'm not sure if you guys realize this, but he wrote a few books, and so it's entirely possible to be a fan and to have missed half of what he's written. And so I kind of went back in and dug in and re-engaged with the Dark Tower in a way that I hadn't initially. Like I was a big fan of the Gunslinger, like the first book, and which is fantastic.
One of the
And then
greatest opening lines of any book
oh
that just
yeah,
draw you right in.
so simple and sort of totemic and perfect. But I'd fallen off. Like my reading of the Dark Tower saga had atrophied, and so like I went back into it. I guess at this point now it's like 6 or 7 years ago, and kind of re-engaged with that idea um, of of his own multiverse and
Hmm.
what that meant. And so yeah, like the conceit was in the book before, but I don't
Yeah.
think that line had existed in its current state until I had finished that deep
Okay. That's completely fair. I enjoyed it. It was one of those moments where you read it twice and you're like, huh, okay, see what
There
he's
it
doing
is.
here. Um, Now, again, we're gonna say it 40 times, not spoiling the ending. Is this story something you could see yourself continuing on, or is this the one and done final word um, on kind of, I guess, what your approach on the story was? Like, do you feel like there's another story to tell later on, especially with your daughter in her life, or do you think this is kind of the I wrote it, I'm happy with it, I don't need to Stephen King it and keep going forward?
I'm a fan of the self-contained story. Like
Hmm.
I think, despite the fact that I work in television, which is all about ongoing, continuing, like how do we spin this further and further and further?
How do we
I,
bring this guy back?
yeah, like nobody's dead in science fiction. Let's go. Um, but I think this had been designed as a single story, as a beginning, middle, end,
Hmm.
as Warren Ellis used to call it, a slab of culture, like that you can pick up and get the total package and then move on with your life. That said, um, there in the intervening years, especially the last 2 or 3 years, I've started to give some idle thought into what other stories are there in this world and what of the characters that we see in this potentially first Adora story um, that could have more adventures or earlier
Hmm.
adventures or more stories to tell. And I think there might be. The thing that I'm not that I'm trying to avoid is that feeling of like you're a garage band, like you and your high school buddies have been like working for forever and ever, and your entire lives get synthesized into your first album, right?
Hmm.
And like you've had 20 years of life that you get to put into one record, and it breaks big, and then you go on tour and you write your second album
Mm.
on the tour bus, like driving from Paris to Lyon, or
Hmm.
from London to Liverpool, or whatever it is. And so like I've had 15 years to tell this version of the story, and I don't know if like I could do the second version of the story. Like, yeah, come on. When's the pub date? Are we already planting the
Yeah.
flag? 2023. All right, yeah, I can
Hmm.
make that up. So I'm not rushing it, but I'm also not closing the door on it, because I think that there probably is more. There's more story. There's more juice left in this particular fruit.
That's probably one of the most honest and reflective answers, especially when I'm sure there's an executive producer at home watching the first film of something, be like, how much did it make?
Yeah.
Greenlight that second one.
Yes, let's go.
Um,
Let's make it happen. But I do believe that like stories have their natural form,
yeah.
and to attempt to bastardize that form is tricky and fraught with peril. And so I'm very careful about um, doing too much with what might not be enough.
And this was such a, it's a very personal experience, and, writing about your kids in a sense in any way. Um, and you lay out the good, the bad, and the ugly all in one sweeping type of ideal. Like, how difficult was that? Kind of just laying a lot of yourself out there. I mean, when you write, you lay a lot of yourself out there, but this was a lot, a lot. How was that?
It was therapeutic, I think, in ways I didn't expect it to be, because story is story, and I've
Hmm.
written my fair share of them. But you know, it is, for me at any rate, easier to process things when they are not as they seem. It's the allegorical nature of science fiction and genre and fantasy, which is you're very often writing about, the things you're writing are not what you're writing about, but what you're writing about
Hmm.
is in it.
Yeah.
And so, sometimes you can exercise certain demons in ways you didn't expect to. And so I think, and I didn't see it at the moment while I'm writing it, because again, it's just, okay, there's underground pirates and there's a big pirate battle, and like that'll be super fun.
Hmm.
But it was sort of looking back on it and rereading it, and there's 40 drafts of this story, in a folder somewhere on my desktop, and in each
Hmm.
one of them finding new things in it and going a little bit deeper in it. And so that process was actually really helpful for me as I
Hmm.
changed over the time, as my daughter changed over time, as the story changed
Hmm.
over time. They sort of begin to reflect each other. And so there were definitely moments of clarity that I had working on this about autism and about children and about narrative, um, that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
Hmm. That's and again, just putting the pen to paper and writing something like this and having such a widespread connective story, I just, again, kudos to you. It just absolutely, from beginning to end, is wonderful, and I cannot recommend it enough. Really briefly, obviously I don't want to consume all of your time. Just a couple quick things on your very long storied writing career. um what has been your favorite thing to write?
Um, you
Not putting
know,
you under pressure here or anything.
no, it's there are things that I've written that nobody will see for years and years,
Hmm.
because television either works at a snail's pace or way faster than you can hold on.
Yeah.
But like, so there's things that I hope that an audience will get to look at that mean quite a bit to me, that are held very close, that I would love to be able to show that to people and even be able to talk about in public. But there's contracts make things more difficult than you'd think they would. Um, but I think I really really I loved working on Adora, and I hope people can see that love in the work. I loved writing Genius, which I did with my buddy Adam Freeman for Top
Hmm.
Cow and Image Comics. Um, but I think the thing that I dug the most is we got to do a Nightcrawler origin comic book. It was X-Men Origins Nightcrawler,
Hmm.
which, the pitch for us, like Marvel was like, hey man, do you want to do a Nightcrawler book? We're doing this origin series and just tell the beginning of Nightcrawler. And so we pitched it as, we want to do Nightcrawler as if he's Dumbo. Like, we want him to feel as if he's the freak in a circus, and the
Hmm.
pathos and the emotion and the betrayal and the abuse and all of that stuff. Like, we want to make people cry about the beginning of Nightcrawler, and
Hmm.
I think we got there. And like, that's the kind of thing that I just love to do, which is to take a thing that you're familiar with and find a new wrinkle in it and kind of excavate a little bit of emotion that might not have been there before, and then reinsert it into it, and then like back away and go about your
Hmm.
life. It's a one shot. Like, it's never
Yeah.
gonna, it's not going to be the totemic piece of work. It's not going to be some, the shiny thing on a hill. But it's like, we
Hmm.
get to tell that one story once where Nightcrawler was Dumbo, and that was kind of cool,
Yeah.
right? Like, yeah.
And it's something too, as long as you're happy with it at the end and you see the reactions to it, you're like, yeah, I did something right here. I definitely
Yeah.
did something right here.
If
Um,
one person gets it, that's plenty.
yeah. Just wanted to briefly touch on too, after some Twitter snooping, I saw a Kickstarter for a certain film that you have written and directed, if that is correct, called Splinter.
I have written and will direct.
Written and will direct. All right.
Yes.
Which writing and directing is always fun because the only person you could be mad at is yourself for the direction of
uh,
how the writing was taken.
yeah,
So
no.
real quick, this project, let's talk about it. We want to get this Kickstarter fully funded. If you have a moment.
Absolutely. It has been the wildest month, with this Kickstarter. We are now, I think, like 48 hours from closing the campaign. Um, and the idea came. I was in Vancouver with Kevin Smith. We were doing a live show, a live podcast up there, and so we were driving around town. And he was like, "Hey, man, I got this call, about the Twilight Zone. about Jordan Peele was doing the new Twilight Zone. They wanted to know if I wanted to do an episode, and Kevin Second, I said yes because of course you're going to do a Twilight Zone. And he's like, "Do you want to do it with me?" And I said yes because I've learned that when Kevin asks me if I want to do something, my default answer is yes.
Yes.
Um, so and we just started talking idly about what to do, and he's like, "Well, they had this idea for this thing, I had this idea for this thing," and on the plane ride home, it sort of occurred to me that Twilight Zone always does one of two stories, amongst lots of things. But every iteration of Twilight Zone has a story on a plane, and it has
Mm-hmm.
a story about a creepy kid who has powers. And by the time I landed, like I texted, Kevin this, like 120 word pitch for like, what if there's a plane that never lands, and what if the only passenger on this plane is a 10-year-old boy who never gets to set foot on the ground because when he does, bad things happen. And so there's this entire apparatus to keep him off the ground. And what if shit goes wrong? And it's like, that's cool. And so we should do that. And then, but the Twilight Zone opportunity just evaporated. Like it as so many things do in Hollywood, it just kind of went up in
Mm-hmm.
smoke. But I held on to that idea. I'm like, I still think that's cool.
Yes.
And so the beginning of the pandemic, I was looking down the barrel of age and of, I'm like, I'm going to be 50 soon. And I'd always made myself a promise that I was going to try and direct a movie before I was 50. And maybe it's a short film and not a feature film. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's this. Like, let's try and do this. So that was the first thing I was able to write coming out of the sort of pandemic fog was the script for the short film. And then, you know, a friend of mine who's made a bunch of short films who I trust implicitly came on board as a producer. We found a line producer who started specking out a budget. And because it's on a plane, it got very expensive very fast. It wasn't going to be like three friends in a hotel room. It was like, no, guys, we're on a plane. We need special effects. We need sets. We need all of these things. You're
Can't
building a
film it in a
world.
bathtub. Can't do any of that fun stuff.
Can't, like my house cannot be the location of this short. So we can need to spend some money.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we thought about it because there was a version of it where I was like, listen, if it's X, I can script for X. Like, I make a pretty decent living as a TV writer. I've got some savings. My wife will allow me to spend but so much, but I can spend some. And then the minute we got the budget, like that's not possible. So we went to Kickstarter, and I was afraid because we were asking for a lot of money. And in my research for Kickstarter, looking at short films and like the budgets were this and that, whatever, like, oh, we're asking for 4 times the average budget of a short film on Kickstarter. And Kevin kept saying, it's like, man, I don't think you understand. Like, I don't think you know that there's an audience for the podcast, there's an audience for the work, there's an audience for you that will come out and support this if you present it to them. And I didn't believe it. And so we started the Kickstarter almost a month ago, and we fully funded in 14 hours.
Wow.
Which, and again, we're asking for a lot of money. We were
Mm-hmm.
asking for $90,000, and we hit that in 14 hours. And then stretch goals, and like, okay, if we can get to 110, then we can pay for special effects. And we can get to
Mm-hmm.
140, then we can pay for all of the post and the score and everything.
Yeah.
And anything above and beyond that, we just get to pay people what they're worth.
Yeah.
We don't need to charge like friend discounts anymore. We don't have to count on the kindness of strangers. We can actually give them what they're owed. And so as of yesterday, with 48 hours left, we're at $220,000, which I remain humbled and astonished and flummoxed by the amount of support and generosity from both people that I know
Yeah.
and no, I probably would have given some stuff to if like, come on, man, you make good money. Like you drop something in the bucket. And then people I've never met before and people whose names I don't recognize who just came out and donated quite a bit. So we're making a movie. Trisha Helfer is going to star in it. Yetide Badaki from American Gods will be in it. Tiffany Smith, who's got a role in Master of the Universe Revelation, will be in it. Still a couple roles left to be cast, but yeah, like by the end of this year, we will have a movie in the can, one way or another. So,
and we'll be back here talking about it
we
because
will be
that is
back here talking about it.
so real quick, I mean, that's just a testament to your writing. People have faith in it. And money walks in that one, and it just it really does. So I just like to end here with first saying this was an absolute pleasure to talk with you. Please go out, read Adora in the Distance. It is available through Comixology, through Amazon. Go look into Marc's Kickstarter for Splinter. His Twitter handle is at Tolkien Negro. That is Tolkien, like the writer, and obviously you know the second word. Finally, look for this review and possible podcast or YouTube video at GateCrashers.fan. Follow us at GateCrashersPod on Instagram and Twitter. And follow me on Twitter as well, at ArgRJ. That is ARGHRJ. Again, Marc Bernardin, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, RJ. This was fun.